Welcome to my economics channel. This video might feel incredibly long, but if you choose to stay with me until the very end, you may finally understand exactly how wealth moves across the world and why most ordinary people never see it coming. Have you ever wondered why 100 years ago, Britain was the undisputed factory of the world? Why did that grand title shift to the United States 50 years ago? Why did it then move to Japan 30 years ago before handing the crown to China? And why, in today's financial news, do we constantly see names like Vietnam, India, and Mexico quietly taking over the baton? This phenomenon is absolutely not a random accident of history. What we are witnessing is a master script of wealth transfer, a cycle that has already circulated the globe 5 distinct times. If you do not understand this underlying logic, reading the daily news will always leave you blind and confused. You will only read superficial headlines, completely unaware that the exact same script is repeating itself on a global stage. The ordinary person looks at the world through the lens of permanence. We build cities of concrete and steel, believing our current prosperity will last forever. We suffer from the cognitive bias that success is static. But the reality of global economics is radically different. Capital is a fluid entity. It has no loyalty to any flag, no attachment to any history, and no sentimentality toward any workforce. The global migration of industry is, at its very core, a relentless history of chasing costs and profits when the costs of labor, land, and resources in one nation inevitably rise. Low-value-added industries must flow toward regions with much lower costs. The nation left behind has no choice but to leap toward higher profit margins or face immediate stagnation. This is an ironclad rule that has remained completely unchanged for 300 years. Every single time this shift occurs, it acts as a brutal relay race for nations. Someone takes the baton and sprints toward the absolute peak of prosperity, while those who drop the baton are forced to leave the global stage in complete obscurity. When we look at the current state of the world, it is easy to feel overwhelmed by anxiety. People worry about job security, about inflation, about the disappearing opportunities in their own hometowns. They feel the squeeze as their industries slowly migrate to unseen shores. This psychological dread stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how the world machine actually operates. Between the years 2001 and 2007, those few individuals who actually understood this global script quietly made massive fortunes. They positioned themselves exactly where the capital was flowing. Now, another massive window of opportunity has just opened. But to grasp it, you must discard your emotional attachments and look at the cold, hard data of industrial migration. Today, we stand at the absolute critical threshold of the fourth industrial revolution. We are no longer just shifting sweatshops across the ocean. We are facing an era where artificial intelligence is fundamentally restructuring the very nature of labor. History has already written the final answer. Every major technological revolution ultimately triggers a violent reshuffling of global wealth. The gap between the old order and the new order is widening by the second. The difference between low-cost physical labor and high-profit algorithmic capital has never been more extreme. And this time, the time window left for ordinary people to adapt might be considerably shorter than anyone has ever imagined. To see tomorrow, we must first deeply analyze yesterday. We must analyze how nations make choices driven by deep fear and boundless greed. We must observe how corporate giants relocate entire supply chains overnight to protect their precious margins. To understand why the global economic structure looks the way it does today, we must journey back to the very first spark of this 300-year relay race. Let us begin uncovering the truth. Chapter summary sentence. Wealth truly never evaporates. It merely finds a new geography to grow. Chapter 2. The first transfer. Britain to America. Before we can truly understand where capital is flowing today, we must examine the very first time the world experienced a massive industrial migration. Many people hold the deeply flawed misconception that the British Industrial Revolution was created entirely by British people out of thin air. The reality of economic evolution is always much more complex and deeply interconnected. The earliest sparks of the Industrial Revolution actually ignited within the textile industry. For thousands of years, the deep roots of advanced textile techniques had already been firmly planted in China. Chinese artisans had pushed the absolute limits of what human hands could achieve with silk jacquard weaving technologies. The British did not invent the core concept of weaving. They merely studied these ancient techniques and found a way to magnify them brutally. They used the relentless power of the steam engine to mechanize what Chinese workers had done by hand. This mechanical transformation was the true catalyst for the first great global industry transfer. It was the moment human labor was first systematically replaced by iron and coal. The spinning jenny and the water frame fundamentally redefined the meaning of productivity. By replicating the delicate motions of human hands with tireless machines, Britain rapidly ascended to the unprecedented position of the world factory. They built an empire on the roar of engines. However, the fundamental nature of capital dictates that no throne can be held forever. The process of industrialization itself carries the seeds of its own eventual decline. As the factories churned out unprecedented wealth, the domestic workers began to demand a larger share of the profits. The inevitable rise in labor wages slowly but surely began to squeeze the profit margins of the factory owners. High profits naturally decay into high costs. Furthermore, the British Empire faced the enormous financial burden of maintaining an expansive network of global colonies. The administrative and military costs of ruling a quarter of the earth slowly became an unbearable weight. The British manufacturing sector gradually found itself struggling to compete in a world it had originally created. Capital always seeks the path of least resistance, and Britain was becoming too heavy, too expensive, and too complacent. While Britain was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own success, a drastically different scenario was unfolding on the other side of the globe. We must first look at the victims of this era to understand the true cruelty of industrial shifts. In the 19th century, China was not a winner in the global capital transfer, but rather a tragic victim. The Qing dynasty suffered from deep arrogance and fatal isolationism. The Chinese rulers believed they were the center of the universe, arrogantly dismissing industrial machinery as mere bizarre tricks. They completely missed the greatest window of industrialization because of their blind pride. After industrializing, Britain desperately needed cheap raw materials and massive consumer markets. China possessed both in abundance. Thus, British industrial goods flooded Chinese markets, utterly shattering the local handcraft and textile industries under the weight of superior efficiency. While ancient empires crumbled under the pressure of the new reality, across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was perfectly positioned to catch the baton. America was a blank canvas for capital. What did America possess at that crucial moment? They had vast expanses of untouched land, virtually unlimited natural resources, and a continuous torrent of highly driven immigrants. These immigrants brought desperation, boundless ambition, and a willingness to provide extremely cheap labor. The late 19th century witnessed the birth of entirely new industrial titans. Men like Carnegie in the steel industry and Rockefeller in the oil industry did not just build companies. They forged entirely new monopolies of power. They understood that the future did not belong to the textile mills of Manchester, but to heavy industry, electricity, and oil. They ruthlessly capitalized on the lower labor costs and abundant resources of the New World. The contrast between the two nations became stark and undeniable as British textile mills and steel factories began to shut down under the pressure of high domestic wages. Capital swiftly crossed the ocean. The capitalists in London quickly realized that moving their operations or investments to the United States would generate significantly higher returns. The cruel truth of economics is that money has no patriotism. It only has a calculating appetite for growth. In the year 1908, we saw the birth of the Ford assembly line, a masterpiece of industrial efficiency. This innovation brutally slashed the cost of a car from over $800 to slightly over $200. This was the ultimate triumph of process optimization. By the year 1913, the industrial output of the United States officially surpassed that of Great Britain. The United States had successfully completed the first great industrial transfer, becoming the #1 manufacturing power in the world. From the moment they took the baton to the moment they reached the absolute summit, it took them only about 40 years. 40 years to completely rewrite the global economic hierarchy. But as we will soon see, the burden of the crown eventually corrupts the wearer, preparing the stage for the next great migration. Chapter summary sentence. The architect of the old order ultimately becomes the victim of its own inflated operational costs. Chapter 3. The second transfer, America to Europe and Japan. Following the devastation of World War II, the United States found itself standing alone at the absolute pinnacle of global power. During this period, the American economy accounted for nearly 50% of the entire global gross domestic product. It was an era of unprecedented prosperity, where the American working class enjoyed high wages and an exceptionally high standard of living. However, this illusion of permanent economic invincibility masked a quietly growing vulnerability. As the factory workers demanded better lifestyles and higher compensation, the fundamental operating costs of American manufacturing began to climb dramatically. The traditional blue-collar industries were slowly becoming too expensive to maintain their previous profit margins. Capital, always restless, began scanning the horizon. It was at this precise historical moment that the second great industrial transfer occurred. Yet, this specific migration was entirely unique in human history. Unlike the first transfer, which was purely driven by the invisible hand of the free market seeking lower costs, this movement was intentionally initiated by the United States itself. Why would a dominant superpower willingly give away its unrivaled industrial advantage? The answer lies deep within the geopolitical anxiety of the Cold War. The United States was consumed by the terrifying prospect of the Soviet Union expanding its influence across a broken Europe and a devastated Asia. America desperately needed strong, industrialized allies to serve as a geopolitical shield. Driven by this deep existential fear, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, pouring enormous amounts of financial capital to rebuild the shattered foundations of Western Europe. Simultaneously, the American occupation forces took complete control of reconstructing the completely destroyed industrial system of Japan. Former bitter enemies were rapidly transformed into crucial strategic economic partners. The United States began to export its automobile manufacturing capabilities, electronic technologies, and precision engineering secrets directly to Germany and Japan. There is a profound irony hidden in this historical chapter, involving an American quality management expert named Deming. In America, immersed in post-war arrogance, absolutely no one paid attention to his revolutionary theories. Ignored at home, Deming traveled across the ocean to Japan to teach his methodologies. Astonishingly, he quickly became the utterly revered spiritual guide for the entire Japanese manufacturing renaissance. Through this relentless pursuit, of precision and quality control, the rebuilt nations suddenly erupted with astonishing productive capability. They capitalized on lower initial labor costs combined with superior process engineering. From the ashes of defeat, Germany swiftly birthed industrial behemoths like BMW and Siemens. Meanwhile, Japan leveraged its rebuilt infrastructure and meticulous work ethic to create global titans such as Toyota and Sony. What started as a geopolitical chess move to counter Soviet expansion rapidly evolved into a devastating economic reality for the American working class. Within less than 30 years, these two defeated nations had completely transformed their destinies. They upgraded from manufacturing cheap electronics to producing highly complex, precision machinery and high-quality automobiles. They applied unprecedented pressure on the American manufacturing sector, leaving the original master breathless and struggling to compete on its own terms. The student had surpassed the teacher. This second transfer teaches us a brutal lesson about human arrogance and institutional complacency. The United States assumed it could control the flow of technology and retain the absolute highest profit margins while exporting lower-tier labor, but ambition cannot be contained. Once a nation learns the rhythms of industrialization, it will inevitably climb the value chain and challenge the hegemon. Chapter Summary Sentence. Capital migration is often disguised as charity, when it is actually driven by geopolitical survival. Chapter 4. The third transfer, Rise of Asia. By the 1960s and into the 1980s, the global industrial machine required another massive realignment. Europe, the United States, and Japan had successfully upgraded their domestic economies to focus entirely on high-end, capital-intensive manufacturing. Consequently, the low-profit, exhausting labor associated with textiles, shoes, toys, and basic light industry became completely undesirable for their highly paid domestic workforces. Furthermore, Japan faced severe limitations regarding its insufficient natural resources and exceedingly narrow domestic market. This forced its capital to seek cheaper horizons for rapid expansion. The answer emerged in the form of the four Asian tigers: South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Once again, the Cold War geopolitical chessboard played a monumental role in directing the flow of global capital. The United States actively cultivated and supported these specific regions to send a clear ideological signal across Asia. By deliberately pumping capital and manufacturing orders into these territories, the Western powers aimed to prove that embracing global capitalism would inevitably lead to boundless prosperity and better living standards for the ordinary citizen. But political will alone cannot force industrial success. These four regions possessed a crucial underlying advantage rooted deeply in their cultural emphasis on education and discipline. The labor force was exceptionally high in quality, remarkably easy to manage, and culturally conditioned to endure brutal working conditions. Local governments swiftly adopted aggressive export-oriented strategies, pushing their cheap labor advantage to the absolute extreme. For a brief window of merely 20 to 25 years, these economies executed a textbook industrial leap. The wealth generation was violent, catapulting their gross domestic product per capita from a pitiful few $100s to staggering heights of $20,000 to $30,000. Yet, this very prosperity instantly raised their internal operating costs, meaning the capital would soon need to move again. Chapter Summary Sentence. The third transfer was a perfect synchronization of geopolitical strategy and utterly desperate labor. Chapter 5. The fourth transfer. China becomes the factory. The previous three industrial transfers were monumental in their own right, but their combined scale completely pales in comparison to the fourth Great Migration. In 1978, a sleeping giant finally awakened and opened its massive doors to the global market. China possessed something no other nation could possibly offer to the world. A population of over 1 billion people and a seemingly infinite pool of incredibly cheap labor. Global capital, utterly starved for new margins, had discovered its ultimate playground. How does a single nation absorb the entire world's manufacturing capacity in such a short time? It requires both extreme human desperation and unprecedented policy execution. We witnessed Shenzhen, a humble and quiet fishing village, violently transform into the undisputed manufacturing capital of the world overnight. Special economic zones bloomed across the southern coastline like wildfire. The peasantry traded their agricultural plows for factory uniforms, willingly trading their sweat and youth for the faint promise of a better future. Then came the absolute pivotal year of 2001. China officially joined the World Trade Organization, thoroughly intertwining its destiny with the global capitalist machine. Foreign capital did not just trickle in, it flooded the nation like a catastrophically broken dam. Global corporations saw an unbeatable mathematical formula. The absolute lowest human costs combined with meticulous discipline. Consequently, the country swiftly absorbed approximately 60% of all global manufacturing orders. When Western democracies willingly outsourced their industrial base to Asia, they suffered from a fatal cognitive bias. They arrogantly believed they could forever retain the high-profit intellectual property while permanently offloading the dirty, low-margin sweatshop labor. They completely failed to recognize that manufacturing is a living, breathing ecosystem. Once you willingly surrender the assembly line, you inevitably lose the engineering expertise, the supply chain dominance, and eventually the very power of innovation itself. They did not remain content with remaining at the absolute bottom of the global food chain forever. The evolution was staggering, calculated, and relentless. They started by simply stitching cheap shirts, weaving socks, and assembling plastic toys. But steadily, through unimaginable labor, they climbed the value chain to produce complex home appliances, high-end smartphones, and eventually advanced new energy vehicles. They essentially mastered and dominated nearly every single product category humanly possible. The numbers underlying this brutal transformation are absolutely terrifying to comprehend from a historical perspective. China's share of global manufacturing skyrocketed from less than 5% to an astonishing 28%. Economic historians frequently note that China managed to compress Britain's entire 200-year journey of painful industrialization into a mere 30 years. This was not a magic miracle. It was the mathematical result of over 1 billion people grinding through relentless overtime. Let us deeply examine the raw human cost hidden beneath this glaring economic miracle. Behind every cheap flat-screen television and discounted pair of sneakers existed a profound tragedy of segmented families. Millions of rural workers migrated to coastal megacities, leaving their children behind in impoverished villages. The massive capital accumulated in Wall Street bank accounts was directly extracted from the physical exhaustion and stolen time of an entire generation of anonymous laborers. But human greed inevitably complicates the linear accumulation of national wealth. As the manufacturing sector flourished, a darker financial temptation emerged within the nation. Between 1992 and 2002, the country actively suppressed real estate investments to nurture manufacturing. However, by 2003, real estate was officially crowned as the pillar industry, instantly becoming the most lucrative avenue for domestic capital. The easy wealth of property speculation began to corrupt the hard-won industrial foundation. Imagine the psychological agony of a traditional factory owner during the late 2000s. They spent countless sleepless nights battling tiny margins, managing thousands of workers, and dealing with brutal global supply chains. Yet, they watched in absolute horror as financial speculators made fortunes overnight merely by trading empty concrete boxes. The realization that financial capitalism handsomely rewards speculation over actual production marked the beginning of the end for pure manufacturing supremacy. Why spend a decade managing a grueling factory when flipping a single apartment yields exponentially higher profits? This shift in human psychology caused precious talent and massive capital to abandon manufacturing and swarm directly into real estate. Consequently, the opportunity cost for domestic manufacturing steadily climbed to unbearable levels. The relentless boom in property values directly pushed up land prices and living costs, violently squeezing the very factory owners who originally built the economic miracle. The era of seemingly infinite, exhaustible human labor was quietly drawing to a definitive close. The single-child generation had finally grown up, and they absolutely refused to spend their lives trapped on monotonous assembly lines like their parents did. The massive demographic dividend that fueled the fourth transfer began to evaporate into thin air. The underlying costs slowly crept up, and the global capital machine, always cold and calculating, prepared to tear up the script and start again. Chapter Summary Sentence. The ultimate sweatshop of the world swallowed the global supply chain whole, trading cheap human labor for unprecedented economic dominance. Chapter 6. The fifth transfer. The world reshapes again. Around the years 2010 and 2012, the global economic tectonic plates began to violently shift once again. Multinational corporations, driven entirely by the relentless pursuit of maintaining their sacred profit margins, began packing up their factories and fleeing toward cheaper horizons. We have officially entered the fifth great industrial transfer, a terrifying reshaping of the world that is happening right before our very eyes. The era of infinite and unbelievably cheap labor officially expired as the underlying costs relentlessly multiplied. As the factories upgraded and the domestic economy swelled with capital, the fundamental wages of the average worker soared to unprecedented heights. The cruel reality of capitalism rapidly emerged. Even with much higher wages offered on the table, factory bosses discovered they simply could no longer find enough human beings willing to stand on the soul-crushing assembly lines. We must deeply analyze the profound psychological transformation of the modern workforce to truly understand this shift. The heavy debt of the strict one-child policy finally came due with devastating precision. An entire generation raised as the absolute sole focus of their families reached adulthood, and they absolutely refused to surrender their youth to the monotonous, greasy floors of traditional manufacturing plants. Their desires permanently shifted from mere survival to personal meaning. Then came the brutal geopolitical awakening, sometime around 2018, when severe tariffs were suddenly smashed onto global trade routes by the Trump administration. The fragile illusion of seamless globalization was shattered instantly. The masterminds sitting in comfortable corporate boardrooms panicked, realizing the terrifying strategic danger of keeping all their vital manufacturing eggs in one single geographic basket. Fear became the ultimate driver of capital migration. Absolute technology giants like Apple began aggressively moving their highly profitable smartphone assembly lines directly into India. Make no mistake, this massive shift was not because the Indian infrastructure was inherently superior at that specific moment. It was a purely defensive strategy driven by deep institutional fear, creating a desperate backup plan to ensure their trillion-dollar supply chains could survive, a complete geopolitical decoupling between superpowers. Simultaneously, a ruthless internal cleansing was deliberately triggered within the former world factory itself. The skyrocketing cost of urban land in eastern megacities made it mathematically impossible for low-end manufacturers to merely survive. Local governments ruthlessly enforced strict environmental protection standards, forcing thousands of heavily polluting traditional factories to shut their doors permanently. They intentionally cleared out the cheap industries to violently force a high-end upgrade. But here is the utterly fascinating detail that most ordinary observers completely miss about this specific cycle. Unlike the previous 4 transfers, which were strictly one-way streets where a nation abandoned an industry entirely, this 5th transfer is a highly complex bidirectional output. The fundamental rules of the 300-year relay race have mutated before our very eyes, creating a scenario never before seen in economic history. On one hand, we are witnessing the highly predictable downward flow of low-end capacity. The sweaty, exhausting assembly lines are relentlessly marching toward Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, and Mexico. These developing nations are desperately snatching the baton of cheap labor, blindly hoping to replicate the astonishing economic miracles of the past. But they are merely inheriting the lowest margin work, exchanging their natural resources and human capital for pennies. On the other hand, something truly unprecedented is occurring that deeply terrifies the old Western hegemons. The high-end domestic industries are actively and aggressively piercing directly into the heavily guarded heart of developed nations. We see corporate titans like BYD constructing the largest electric vehicle factories right in Hungary. We see giants like CATL building massive high-tech battery plants on German soil. Furthermore, heavyweights like Huawei have systematically planted extensive research and development centers throughout Europe and Canada. This is no longer just submissively receiving foreign investment. It is a deliberate, aggressive insertion into the high-profit territories and standard-setting systems of the wealthy world. Meanwhile, the crucial middle layer, the core supply chain components, advanced materials and equipment, remains firmly gripped within their own domestic borders. When a consumer purchases a smartphone assembled in a brand new factory in Vietnam, they suffer from a profound cognitive illusion. They foolishly believe the wealth has fully shifted away. Yet, a massive proportion of the complex internal components hidden inside that device were still manufactured and exported from the original source. The true power now lies exclusively in controlling the algorithm, the standards, and the global supply web, not the final assembly. The nation that was once ridiculed as a mere sweatshop has voluntarily relinquished the physical assembly line to the desperate. In its place, it has spat out sophisticated algorithms, absolute control over industry standards, and a terrifying capacity for global strategic layout. The relay race is no longer about who can sweat the most blood. It is entirely about who can think the fastest and control the deepest roots of capital. Chapter summary sentence. The global capital ecosystem will ruthlessly discard the obsolete to make room for the highly profitable. Chapter 7. The Age of AI and Industrial Collapse. We stand at the absolute precipice of the 4th Industrial Revolution, a paradigm shift that will completely obliterate historical rules of wealth. The previous 3 revolutions were primarily designed to liberate human physical strength. However, this new era possesses a much more profound ambition. The ultimate goal of artificial intelligence is not to replace our hands, but to ruthlessly conquer and replicate human brainpower and complex decision-making. Examine the brutal contrast between old manufacturing and the new reality. In the past, a factory's competitiveness relied entirely upon endless human bodies and exhausting overtime hours. Tomorrow, the smart factory relies exclusively on artificial intelligence algorithms paired with tireless robotics. In Dongguan, advanced algorithms optimized supply chains, slashing inventory cycles from 45 days down to 18 days. instantly saving hundreds of millions in operating capital. What happens to ordinary workers when machines learn to think? The artificial intelligence era does not simply eliminate the laborer, it ruthlessly divides the workforce. A blue-collar worker who actively learns to command the new algorithm will suddenly earn a considerably higher salary than an obsolete white-collar manager. Those who stubbornly refuse to adapt will swiftly find themselves completely erased from the global economic equation. This terrifying transformation extends far beyond the greasy factory floors. In the modern service industry, the desperate struggle for internet traffic is rapidly replaced by the pursuit of genuine experience. Artificial intelligence can now effortlessly generate video scripts, edit complex footage, and deploy flawless virtual humans for continuous live broadcasting. Consequently, the financial barrier to acquiring digital traffic has been violently flattened for absolutely everyone. In content creation, the archaic method of blindly chasing viral trends is utterly obsolete. An algorithm can flawlessly write 100 persuasive sales scripts in exactly 10 seconds. However, the machine intrinsically lacks a human soul. The future rewards individuals who delegate baseline work to the machine, allowing the human creator to exclusively focus on injecting unique perspectives and deep emotional empathy into the final product. Finally, observe the absolute disruption of the financial sector. Historically, wealth management relied entirely upon exploiting information asymmetry between elites and ordinary citizens. Today, artificial intelligence can instantly analyze vast oceans of global market data, rapidly evaporating any traditional information gap. Yet, the cold machine cannot calculate human greed, nor can it accurately predict the subtle nuances of sudden geopolitical policy shifts orchestrated by scared politicians. Chapter summary sentence. The algorithm does not merely replace the sweating hands of physical labor, it coldly devours the very capacity of human decision-making. Chapter 8. Where capital flows next. Vietnam, India, and Mexico are frantically attempting to catch the golden baton of global manufacturing. The old world order believed that cheap labor was the only required magnet for capital. But the reality of the modern economy is brutally different. Simply offering a massive population of inexpensive workers is no longer sufficient to guarantee sustained industrial success. Nations must possess ruthless policy execution, solid infrastructure, and a deep foundation of educated talent. If a country fails to rapidly build its supply chains and educate its workforce, within this crucial 20 or 30-year window, the global capital machine will mercilessly shut the door. The desperate nations will simply miss the cycle entirely. We must ask ourselves, how do we actually profit from understanding these macroeconomic movements? If you understand that the industrial baton is currently being handed to Southeast Asia and Latin America, you can anticipate where the initial infrastructure wealth will bloom. However, you must not simply rush to buy emerging market assets blindly, without understanding the underlying structural risks involved. Remember the brutal historical reality of previous cycles. When the United States sent its steel and textile industries away, it did not bleed to death. It upgraded to manufacture high-margin silicon chips. When Japan surrendered cheap electronics, it monopolized the precision components sector. The shift is never a complete loss for the bold. It is a necessary pruning of obsolete economic branches to foster new growth. Therefore, the true question regarding capital is not whether to invest, but exactly which specific layer of the value chain you should target. The low-end assembly lines are transferred away, but the high-end core technologies are continuously ascending to unprecedented heights. You must position yourself exactly where the innovation resides, not where the physical sweat continuously drips. Chapter summary sentence. Wealth truly never evaporates into thin air. It merely reappears in a different geography within the grand cycle. Chapter 9. What this means for you. We have explored the massive, relentless tides of global capital shifting across 300 years of human history. You might now ask yourself a deeply personal question. How does this grand economic theater actually impact the food on your table? The brutal truth is that your individual destiny is permanently bound to the unseen, cold movement of global supply chains and distant corporate profit margin. When you look around your modern workplace, do you see the hidden fault lines slowly opening beneath your feet? The average person arrogantly believes their professional experience grants them permanent immunity from industrial collapse. Yet, history screams a completely different warning into our deaf ears. Every single time the world transitions to a new paradigm, millions of comfortable workers are violently discarded by the invisible hand of efficiency. Do not passively wait for the artificial intelligence wave to crash over your head. You must desperately learn to stand directly upon the very crest of the crashing wave. Consider the historical precedents that we have already examined. Before the steam engine fully replaced human muscle, the smartest British workers voluntarily learned how to master the iron gears and complex levers. They did not fight the machine, they commanded it. Before the internet completely erased traditional trade borders, astute American farmers were already using early computers to check global market prices. Before China officially joined the World Trade Organization, visionary domestic merchants were already quietly positioning themselves for massive foreign trade exports. These exceptional individuals were absolutely not born as unequivocable geniuses. They merely chose to take one calculated step before the anxious crowd. If you are a traditional office worker today, you must immediately dedicate several months to mastering advanced artificial intelligence tools for writing reports and generating complex designs. If you run a small independent business, you must actively test how the algorithm can drastically reduce your operating costs and simultaneously multiply your invisible customer base without massive advertising budgets. We might not accurately imagine what the ultimate wealth password will look like 20 years from this exact moment. However, we can hold on to one absolute certainty in this unpredictable universe. Those individuals who actively learn new technologies and bravely attempt new methods during this brutal transition will undoubtedly touch the doors of the next wealth era first. Everything fixed and solid is rapidly evaporating into thin air, leaving behind only those who possess true adaptability. The 300-year relay race continues its relentless march across the globe, and the baton is currently suspended in mid-air. Thank you so much for journeying through this deep analytical exploration of our global economic machine. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more unfiltered financial truths. If you could clearly see exactly where the tides of global capital are moving today, would you still blindly choose to walk the exact same path tomorrow? True wealth eternally belongs to those who decipher the hidden rules long before they actually make their first move.